Several years ago, I had been running a software company that I started here in Poland 15 years ago, and I'd been running it for a decade, and I was feeling burned out. The company was, I as a manager had sort of stopped learning, stopped improving. The last few years were pretty much the same. I'd lost my enthusiasm. And so I gave my job to a friend of mine who has reinvigorated the company, is doing wonderful things with it right now. And I decided to take a few years off and as a kind of mini retirement to try to figure out what it is I really want to be doing with my life. And the first part of that was a lot of reflection. I spent a lot of time in coffee shops, reading and reflecting on why it was that I got burned out on my dream job. I had created my own company. I had created my own job. Why didn't I love it? And I realized that most people see me as an agile coach or as a Kanban coach or as a Kanban trainer because I'm always up here talking about, not on this stage, but on other stages, talking about Scrum and Kanban and such. And I realized that was exactly the problem. I have always been an early adopter of new ways of building software because I was so dissatisfied with waterfall 20 years ago. But in the process of becoming an expert in processes of delivering software, I had lost sight of what Agile is all about. In becoming an expert in Scrum and becoming an expert on Kanban and really refining the practices, I had forgotten the first principle in the Agile Manifesto was that we value individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And I had spent a decade becoming an expert in processes and tools. So I decided to work on building up the people part of it. So I spent a lot of time going to anthropology conferences. I rejoined the American Anthropological Society and started reading the journals, reading books on psychology, and just really trying to immerse myself for a couple of years in how humans tick. And I'm not going to sum all of that up here, but what I want to share is I took 3 particular ideas from that experience which play really nicely together and which have had a profound impact on my personal and professional life. And none of these 3 ideas are mine. They've all been well articulated elsewhere. But I think what I have to contribute is that I found a way that they play really nicely together. And I want to talk about those interactions between these systems. So the first came from a book by Nancy Klein called Time to Think. How many of you have read it? I told you to read it. Okay, good. So this is going to be new for most people. She wrote a book called Time to Think, and the inspiration was her mother. She built a whole consulting career on trying to find ways to be her mother. And what was special about her mother is her mother had a way of just energizing people around her. People loved being with her mother, talking with her mother. They felt great around her mother. Her mother had a natural ability that she didn't herself have. And so she started looking at what she was doing, and she realized that her conclusion was that, and it should be pretty obvious, but none of us are doing it. Few of us are doing it. And that is that she realized that people really think well. People among all of, probably of all of the animals, we are probably one of the best at thinking, but we rarely have an opportunity to really use it and exercise it because we live in a chaotic world and our interactions are chaotic. And just as a little thought experiment, imagine that you were having coffee with one of your intellectual heroes, somebody who is just clearly, obviously a genius. Susan Sontag, Genevieve Bell, Neil deGrasse Tyson, somebody like this. what kind of conversation would you have with that person? If you got to sit across the table from Neil deGrasse Tyson or Susan Sontag, would you try to convince them that you know as much about space or media as they do? When they shared an idea, would you try to play devil's advocate with them? Or would you share your own experiences to further enrich the conversation? Maybe. But for myself, and I think most people, I would just try to keep them talking and seated and drinking coffee with me for as long as humanly possible, to suck as many ideas and insights from them as I possibly could. And this is what Nancy realized her mother was doing to everybody. And so she started experimenting, and what she found, and I have found the same conclusions, is that when you treat people as though they are brilliant, when you treat people as though they think really well, when you treat people as though their ideas are precious, they do think better. And that shouldn't be so terribly surprising, because in our normal interactions with people, they tend to be very confrontational. Think about meetings that you're in. The way when a group of people get together to try to solve a problem, usually there's 2 or 3 people in the room who do all the talking. There's usually 2 or 3 people in the room who don't say anything at all. It often turns into a fight between whose idea is going to win, not whose idea is best, and who can possibly think well in that kind of an environment. And so the first big idea that I've been trying to apply to my life, and it's been working very well, is this. When you're dealing with somebody who's trying to think through a problem, who's come to you with a problem to solve or an idea on their mind, and you want to help them, one really useful tool for doing that is to not talk. And it's really simple. There's 3 steps. The first is don't talk, which sounds simple, can be a little bit more difficult in practice. The second is to not think about talking, and that's really difficult. And the reason it's so important is that we humans communicate so much non-verbally that we've got all these tiny little muscles in our face that behave involuntarily to what's going on in our heads. And so when we're talking to somebody and we're making eye contact and they're talking to us, if our mind is someplace else, if even part of our mind is someplace else, we're not fooling anybody. It's blatantly obvious. Our facial reactions are a little bit misaligned. We don't laugh or smile or make eye contact at quite the right moments. And so it's obvious that we're not giving them our full attention. Now, when a person knows 2 things that we usually know in a conversation: 1, I'm not getting this person's full attention, and 2, as soon as I pause to take a breath, they are going to speak. They're going to try to derail this conversation in some way. They're going to share their own ideas or tell me why I'm wrong. How can you possibly think well in those circumstances? So to share a personal story, I put this to the test while I was reading this book. I happened to be visiting my in-laws who have a little farm in the middle of nowhere in Poland. And my wife came up to me to kick off a conversation, one of our 3. We'd been married for 15 years then, and 90% of our conversations fit into one of 2 or 3 models. The most common being, I share, you share. So it starts kind of like, she'll come up and she'll say, I read this interesting thing in the newspaper. And I'll say, I read this interesting thing in the newspaper. And it tends to fizzle out after that pretty soon. And so she started one of these conversations. She said, so I read this interesting thing in the newspaper. And I thought, I just read Nancy Klein. Let's see what happens if I try to use some of those ideas. And so my wife said, I read something interesting in the newspaper. And I said, I'd made up my mind not to share anything, so my brain wasn't busy thinking about what to say. I was just looking at her and interested in what she was going to say next. And I think this scared her for a moment. But after the briefest of moments, and I know this because I was looking at her and not thinking about anything but her face and what she was going to say next, her eyes lit up, and she suddenly seemed to get a fresh burst of energy. And she told me something she thought about that. She told me how she felt about what she had read in the newspaper. And I said, And now she started to get really engaged in the conversation. She was engaged in a conversation that I wasn't participating in as a speaker. And she shared something else. And then she paused for a while, but I could tell she was still thinking because her eyes were focused and she had an intent look on her face. And then she said, that reminds me of something that I read about a year ago. And she drew a connection between two things that was insightful. I don't even actually remember what it was because that was 3 years ago now. But she drew a connection between two things that were separated in space in her experience by a year. And if she hadn't had this space to think through that idea all the way from the observation in the newspaper, all the way through the series of steps to the connection, she might never have had that particular idea. And so that's when I realized that there's other ways to participate in a conversation with a person than by bouncing ideas back and forth. You can choose to participate in a conversation with someone by playing a listening role, by creating a space for them to have their own internal conversation. And it can be really powerful in situations when somebody is trying to solve a problem or think well. And people really, really appreciate this too, because it's very rare in our daily lives that we are ever actually really listened to. You might not, off the top of your head, know what it feels like. So I would really challenge you to try this with someone. When somebody that you care about comes to you with an idea or a problem, try this approach to creating a space to see how they think through it. And I think you'll be surprised, and it's very good for relationships, I guarantee it. It also works, interestingly, in groups. And this is something that Nancy does a lot of, is facilitating thinking space meetings. And the way a thinking space meeting works is that everyone in the meeting comes together to solve a problem. And before they even start, they agree that the rules of the meeting are everyone gets to speak only once, and when someone is speaking, they get all the time they need to fully develop an idea, and everyone will be giving them their full, undivided, respectful attention, which can be a very, very powerful feeling, having a bunch of people giving you their full attention. I tried this once at a conference. At conferences that have open spaces in our community, there's always somebody who talks about outsourcing, who talks about working with remote teams. And so at this conference, I decided I would just jump in and propose that topic, because I knew somebody would. But I proposed it with a caveat, which is that we would have a thinking space conversation about how to deal with offshoring. And anybody who wanted to come to that open space would agree to those rules. And so I explained the rules. And the interesting thing is, in these open spaces, and I've been to half a dozen of them now, the same ideas keep coming up. And they usually get argued between the 2 or 3 loudest people in the group. And in this group, in just a half an hour open space, we had about 15 or 20 people. Each person developing their ideas fully. We ended up coming up with almost a dozen different ideas for how to deal with the problems that occur when you're dealing with non-co-located teams. And many of them came from people who might not have even spoken at all in a more traditional type of a conversation. I also used this in a retrospective a couple of months ago when I had 2 teams that were working together and they had serious trust issues. And it was really interesting to see what would happen when everybody who had trust and respect issues agreed in advance to treat each other with respect for an hour. Because there's this interesting thing. If you treat somebody, the way you treat somebody tends to be the way you think about them. So if you treat somebody with respect, you start finding yourself having more respectful attitudes towards them. And that's exactly what happened. These people all got a chance to speak, including people who I was told never speak up in retrospectives. And they all seem to have very common concerns and passions, and it really strengthened the relationships. So thinking space meetings can actually be much more efficient than the style that we typically use, partially because you get a lot more ideas on the table, but also because when everybody in the meeting feels heard, you get a lot more buy-in with whatever the conclusion is. People who come into a meeting with an idea and that idea isn't adopted because they were shouted down or didn't get a chance to speak, leave not feeling like they had a chance, and so they don't buy into the conclusion of the meeting. But when everyone has a say, you get the best ideas on the table, everyone's been heard, and so you tend to have fewer follow-on meetings and an easier time implementing the conclusions because everyone's bought into them. So that was a really powerful and simple idea for interacting with people who are trying to think through a problem. But that's not the most common kind of conversation that we have. So that brings me to the next big idea that I came across. And this is something that has been kind of buzzing around the Agile community for quite a while, and that's nonviolent communication. I kind of resisted it because, A, the name, I didn't understand the concept. I didn't feel like my communication was violent. I'm not a violent person. But I had plenty of time on my hands, so I read Marshall Rosenberg's book. Who's read Nonviolent Communication? This will be more, but still a minority of the audience, so good. Well, not good. You should all read this book. It's a great book. What I found when I actually got into nonviolent communication, found out what it was about, was number one, the way Marshall Rosenberg talks and thinks about violence is different than me. He uses a much broader definition of violence, which also encompasses what I tended to think about as violence. I think it's fair to say Marshall Rosenberg would define violence as any attempt to judge or coerce another person. And obviously that includes what we tend to think of as violence. So if you're beating a person because they're bad, you're judging them. If you're beating on a person because you want them to do something differently, or you're yelling aggressively at a person because you want them to change their behavior, you're coercing them. But this broader definition of judgment and coercion also extends to all sorts of things that we just take naturally, that we do in our lives every day. I think maybe one of the most extreme examples is compliments. You're really smart. Nobody would think of that as violent, right? That was a great idea, you're really smart. You can't say that without at the same time implying, I have a right to judge whether you're smart or not, and congratulations, you passed this test. You know? So it's really interesting to think about how we would interact with people if we were just trying to express clearly what it was that we wanted and needed, and understand what they wanted and needed, without trying to change their behavior, without trying to coercively change their behavior. And the mechanism that he proposes for doing this is a model, and like any other model, it's just a model, but it's a very useful model, I found. And that is that he suggests that whenever a human being communicates with another human being, no matter how they're communicating or what they're saying, underlying all of that is 4 messages that they're trying to get across to the other person. An observation, a feeling, a need, and a request. They saw or experienced something that caused them to have some sort of a reaction, which was either good or bad. And it was good or bad because it either fulfilled some need that they had, or it challenged or hurt some need that they had. And so they want you to do something differently, either more of that good thing or less of that thing that they didn't like. So I'll give you an example. I think it's easier to explain with an example. Imagine there's a father standing in the kitchen washing dishes and watching his child play on a bicycle out in the street. He's washing dishes and watching her ride up and down the street with her friends. And he notices that she does something she's never done before. She does a wheelie. Do you know what this is when you come up on the back wheel of a bicycle? So his daughter is going in front of the house doing a wheelie on her bicycle. And he feels pride until the moment when the rear wheel of the bicycle hits a stone and twists to the side, and suddenly the bicycle is falling, and in the father's mind, like in slow motion, as he watches his daughter's head come crashing to the ground, missing the stone curb by that much. And you can imagine the reaction, the rush of adrenaline, the terror, as he drops the dishes breaking in the sink, runs to the door and throws it open and says, "Anna, what the hell are you doing? Get in the house!" Now, if Anna was trained in nonviolent communication, and this is one of the cool things about nonviolent communication, it works even if only one party knows it. So if Anna was trained in nonviolent communication and just use this four-part model, instead of doing what she might otherwise do, which is to storm into the house saying, "You never let me do anything," instead, she might say, "Dad, you look really angry. Are you angry at me?" Now, she's wrong. He's not angry. But it's the right kind of question to ask, right? They can have a conversation about this. "I'm not angry, I'm terrified." So we've got the feeling. "Are you terrified because you saw me fall off my bike?" The observation. "Yes, I saw you fall off your bike, and I got really scared because I thought that you were going to fall and hit your head." And she said, "It's my head." So if I fell and hit my head on my bicycle, what is that to you? And he might be able to say, "Well, I saw you fall off your bicycle and almost hit your head on the stone. I felt terrified because I realized in that moment you could just be taken away from me in a moment." And that was a terrifying thought because for the past 14 years, you have been such a part of my life that you fulfill a really important need to be part of something bigger and more important than myself. I've learned to see the world through your eyes, and that gives me such joy and pleasure. I take such pride in watching you grow up and become the woman that you could be. And suddenly to think that all of those things that are so important to me could be taken away from me simply by a fall is terrifying. So now we've got the observation, the feeling, and the need. So she might say, "Well, Dad, would you be okay? Would you feel better if I wore a helmet when I was riding my bicycle?" "Yes, I would love if you wore a helmet when you were riding your bicycle. Please wear a helmet whenever you ride your bicycle." "Sure, that's something I'm willing to do, Dad, because now I understand what it means to you." And likewise, if her father was trained in nonviolent communication, he might have thrown open the door and said, "Anna, come here. I really need to talk to you. When I saw you almost fall off your bicycle, your head almost hit the curb. I felt terrified because yada, yada, yada." He can explain himself clearly. So if only one person understands this model, it can be used regardless of which person it is. But there's a big problem with all of this. I learned both of these models. I learned this approach to having more rich and thought-provoking conversations that created spaces for people to do their best thinking. I learned this model for dealing with, for expressing and for understanding my needs and feelings and learning other people's needs and feelings. But they're both useless. They're both absolutely useless when you forget that they exist. And I always forgot that they exist when I needed them most. Like imagine, for an example, you're a Scrum Master and you're sitting in your office. How many Scrum Masters actually have an office? Imagine you're a Scrum Master sitting at your cubicle and you're just working on a report and your product owner comes back. He's been on vacation for a week and a half and he comes in and he storms over to your desk. And the first you see of him is him looming over you and saying, "What the hell? I go on vacation, I come back, we've got a burn down chart that's been flatlined for the past 7 days. How are we going to meet our sprint goal? What have you been doing?" This is not a moment when even a well-trained person is likely to think, this person seems to be dealing with some really big emotions. Maybe I should use nonviolent communication. And the reason for that is because of the way our brains work, which is just, it's brilliant, The way that our brains deal with a crisis is perfect if you're a monkey on the savannah, because that's where we learn this stuff. Imagine, for example, you're foraging for mushrooms or what have you, and you hear in the bushes, now you don't have much time to stop and think, of all the things I know, what makes that sound? What happens is your brain instantly, it's unfamiliar, and so you feel fear. And when you have a negative emotion, fear, anger, embarrassment, unfortunately, your brain tries to fix it. And the way it tries to fix it is by instantly dredging up every moment in your life when you felt that way and remembering it in excruciating detail. So you hear this, and instantly you have a memory of running up a tree the last time you heard that sound. And you're still alive, so that must have worked. So you're already up the tree. The problem is that as an adult, level-headed person, mature and experienced, working on your computer, when your product owner starts yelling at you, you instantly feel tension, and that's a problem your brain has to fix, and you remember every single time a figure of authority has been abusive to you. The teachers who yelled at you in school, your parents getting angry at you, every time you felt powerless. And remembering something that painful brings up the same painful memories. I could do something really mean to everyone here by saying, remember the last time you did something really embarrassing? And then pausing. If I paused for just a few moments, you'd remember a thing, you'd feel embarrassed, and then you'd remember another embarrassing thing you did, and another embarrassing thing that you did. I can't be the only one this happens to, right? I hate that. I knew exactly what my first 5 memories of embarrassing things are, because they always come up like clockwork. Bing, 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 bing. And so I had these 2 techniques, but I almost never used them, because when I really needed them, I wasn't thinking clearly. And that's when I came across the third thing that ties it all together for me. And that was another difficult one for me, is mindfulness meditation. And it was difficult for me because when I was a teenager, I tried meditation because it was cool. And I tried staring into a candle flame and emptying my mind, and I couldn't, and I felt stupid. Because I thought that's what meditation was. I thought it was emptying your mind, just removing everything that is yourself and being whatever you are when you're not you. And I couldn't do that. That might be a type of meditation. It's not mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness meditation is more like a brain hack, like a trick you can do to train your brain to do a new trick. And it's based on another model. So mindfulness practitioners talk about 2 different mental states, which are usually called being and doing. In a doing state, your mind is active. It's taking in information from all over the place and trying to figure out, of all the things I'm seeing and all the things I'm hearing and all the things I'm feeling, how much of this can I ignore? What's important? What do I need to pay attention to? What is a threat? And this is the state that we're almost always in. I mean, I wouldn't want to cross the street not being in this state. I wouldn't last long. It's very useful. The other state, being, is a state of taking in information in a non-judgmental way, just experiencing what's happening to your mind. And that's a very dangerous way to cross the street, so we don't do it very often. It's very difficult to do. I think in practice, I only really normally am in this state of mind like just moments before I fall asleep, or if I've been laying on a beach for about an hour and there's no dogs or children around and the tide's not coming in, eventually I hit this point at which my brain accepts nothing is going to happen that is any concern of mine. Nothing bad's going to happen. I'm safe. I have no responsibilities. And I think that's the reason why I like beach vacations, especially big abandoned beaches. of which I know several, and I won't tell you what they are. But it's very difficult to get into this state. But there is a technique for learning how to switch your mind into this state, even if only briefly. And that is mindfulness meditation. So I started with a book. I don't think it's the best of the books that I've read, but the book that I read was, Andy Puttercombe, something like this. Can't remember the title of the book. It became a very popular book for a while. I've since read several other books on mindfulness that I think are better. But the exercise that I took from this book, which I started doing, was remarkably simple, takes only a few minutes, and within 3 days, I had my first experience in which it made an impact on my life. And it's such a ridiculously simple exercise that I'd like to try it because it's really a lot easier to talk about when you've experienced it. So while you don't have to do this, I'm going to suggest that we try just a 3 or 4 minute experiment in mindfulness meditation. And the way this works is you simply take a moment to recognize where you are, what's going on around you, what day it is, how you feel, what's going on inside you. Are you tired, hungry? Just acknowledge what's going on around you, what's going on in you, and decide that there's nothing you need to do for the next few minutes. If that's not true, if you need to take a phone call or something, go now. But if you can decide that there's nothing you need to do for the next 3 or 4 minutes, then you decide to do a practice. And the practice is this. With your eyes open or closed, just start counting how many times you breathe. Every time you exhale, count 1. 1, 2. Have you done this before? No? This is funny? No, try it. You might like it. 3, 4, until you get to 10. And when you get to 10, start over again at 1. And just do that for 3 or 4 minutes. You might find while you're doing this that spare thoughts or ideas or even feelings can pop into your head, or a sound or a movement can distract you. And if that happens, this is the thing that I got wrong about meditation the first time. If that happens, that's a thing that happens. It's fine. In mindfulness meditation, there's nothing bad about that. If you're distracted by a noise or a thought or a feeling, just recognize that that happened and decide, no, I'm going to focus on my breathing. And then return your focus to counting your breaths. If you get so distracted, and this happens, if you get so distracted that you lost count, that is also fine and good. Just start over again at 1. So, are you with me? Willing to try this for a few minutes, and then we can talk about what happened? Okay, so take a moment, recognize where you are. It's Friday morning. You're tired, possibly hungover. Recognize where you are, how you're feeling. That's okay. Decide not to do anything for the next 3 or 4 minutes. And I will watch the clock for you. So just start counting your breaths, 1 to 10, and then start over, starting now. I'll tell you when to stop. Okay. It's been 4 minutes. So can I ask, with a show of hands, how many of you found yourself distracted and you realized that you weren't focusing on counting your breaths, but you had to refocus your attention? Now, leave your hand up if you were ever so distracted that you lost count. Yep, quite a few. Now, this is the cool thing that I learned, which is that mindfulness meditation is not the act of counting your breaths or focusing on any particular thing. The trick of mindfulness meditation, the value that comes from mindfulness meditation, is what happens when you, quote unquote, fail, when you lose your attention, and you realize that your brain is doing something you didn't tell it to do. You realize that your brain is having a thought or an idea or a feeling that you didn't choose to have, and you decide to channel your attention back to what you want your brain to be doing, which is counting your breaths. Because there's something really interesting about the way the mind works. If your mind doesn't have your attention, if you don't focus on something on your mind, it simply fades away just as mysteriously as it appears. An idea that drifts into your head from absolutely nowhere will disappear into nowhere if you don't think about it. A feeling that drifts into your head for no apparent reason will drift out again for no apparent reason if you don't focus your attention on it. Ideas and feelings thrive on your attention. And if you recognize that you're having an idea or a thought or a feeling that you don't want to have, if you're capable of recognizing that you're having something going on in your head you don't want to have right now, and you're capable of refocusing your attention on something else, you can make that thing go away. It has no substance, no reality. The practical applications are, how many of you have woken up in the middle of the night with a worry and not been able to fall back asleep? Mindfulness meditation puts me right back to sleep. I find that if I wake up worried about money and I start focusing on my breaths instead of my money worries, I stop worrying about money. The money worry came from nowhere. It goes away to nowhere. Another instance, this is the moment when I realized that mindfulness was perhaps useful and made the connection between the other things. I was riding a tram 3 days after reading this book. I'd been doing these mindfulness exercises for like 3 or 4 minutes a day for only 3 days. And I was on the tram. It was crowded. And I saw down the aisle something that made me feel angry. It's common. I have these antiquated ideas about the way people ought to behave on public transportation. And so I get angry at total strangers. And my typical way of dealing with this, because I hate confrontation and conflict, and I live in Poland, and my Polish is good enough to get by, but not good enough to have a fight. So I feel really helpless. I don't really feel I can go up to some teenager and give them a lecture about what it's like to stand on a moving transportation as a pregnant woman or as an elderly man. And so I just get angry, and I feel mad, and I might glare at the person, and that's all I can do. I feel angry and helpless. And that was happening. I've got time, so quick, funny story. I once did that on a tram in Krakow. The guy's just sitting there. There's a pregnant woman standing next to him, and he's just sitting there, ignoring her, studiously ignoring her. Young man, student, maybe 16, 17 years old, for 5 stops. And I'm sitting like opposite, about 4 meters away, just glaring and getting angrier and angrier at this man. And then we come to a stop, and he leans over and he asks a question to the woman, and she tells him the name of the stop. And he unfolds his cane, and she helps him off the tram. He had no idea she was pregnant. I was just spent 5 tram stops glaring in anger at a blind man. Get some Headspace. That's the name of the app, and Headspace is the name of the book. Thank you. But what was happening is, similar situation. I was on a tram, elderly man gets on, all the seats are taken. I'm way in the back of the tram, and the man stands next to a young man in the front of the tram, and I'm like, come on, kid. And then all of a sudden I had this realization, wait, I just got angry. Why? I didn't choose to be angry. I don't want to be angry. And with that realization, the anger just kind of drained away. And I thought, why did I get angry? The nonviolent communication model would suggest that I have some sort of unfulfilled need, which is somehow threatened by what this kid is doing at the front of the tram. And I started thinking about what need is it of mine that is somehow threatened or unfulfilled by this kind of behavior. Now, I didn't solve the problem for the old man. He can ask for a seat himself. He can speak. But I solved my problem. I applied nonviolent communication to my own needs and feelings in order to better understand what was going on. And I could only do that because with just 3 days of this practice, the exact same thing we just did, I was able to do something that I hadn't been able to do before. Because this is the cool thing, and this is the reason why I wanted you all to do this now. That feeling that you get, that the kind of switch that goes on in your head, just now, when you were doing that and you realized that something was distracting you, and you recognized something was distracting you, and you decided to do something about it, and you refocused your attention someplace else, is the exact same sensation, the exact same thing that happens when the product owner yells at the Scrum Master, and the fear and rages up in the Scrum Master. And the Scrum Master recognizes, wait, this emotion is coming from someplace inside of me. It's not my decision. Rage is not going to help me right now. And so that was the thing. That was the magic key that made these other two techniques, nonviolent communication and thinking spaces and thinking environments, actually useful to me. And the reason why I wanted to share these 3 ideas, not only because they play well together, but because as opposed to what I had been doing for the 15 years before this, being a Scrum evangelist and a Kanban evangelist and such, in those worlds, whenever things aren't working, they always talk about Scrum butt or shallow Kanban or proto-Kanban. You've got to do it right or it won't work. XP has 14 practices. If you do 13 of them, the company will burn down. But the cool thing about all of these techniques is that they all work even when you do them rarely and badly. So if, for example, all of my conversations with my wife are not thinking spaces, and all of the times when she needs to think through a thing, I don't think to create a thinking space for her. But if I sometimes do, I've just made my relationship a little bit better. All of the times when I have conflict or opportunities to connect with other people in my office or in life or in my family, when I could be using nonviolent communications, I often don't. But I sometimes do. And every time I do, it makes those connections a little better. It helps me to understand myself and the people around me a little bit better. It helps me to make people's lives a little bit better by understanding their needs and deciding whether to help them fulfill them or not. I might forget to practice meditation for a week and then start doing it again. I might do it poorly or sporadically. I might do it every other day. But still, if I do it occasionally, every time I do it, it makes me a little bit better. And I notice a few more opportunities to control my own mind and to use more effective techniques for dealing with problems. So that's really cool when you've got an idea, especially 3 ideas, that are so simple and work even if you don't do them correctly or often or well. And that's the reason why I thought that they were worth sharing with other people, because simply being aware of it can make your life occasionally, your interactions with people you care about occasionally, different in a better way. I hope you find them useful. Thank you. All right. So I finished 5 minutes early. I don't think that you'll object to having 5 more minutes of coffee break. So when does the next session start? Is this a half hour? 11:30? Okay. So I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much for being here.